It was the scandal that shook Lagos to its core. Amara, the stunning billionaire daughter, who had everything anyone could dream of, wealth, beauty, and fame, slapped her stepmother Okoro in the middle of a grand family gathering. The slap wasn't just a slap, it was a declaration of war. The entire city buzzed with whispers. How could someone so beautiful, so privileged, behave in such an appalling way? The incident became the talk of the town, making headlines on social media, with everyone wondering what could have driven Amara to such a shocking act of cruelty. But welcome to Mad Stories. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from the heart. Amara was no ordinary girl. She was the daughter of Chief Okoro, one of Nigeria's wealthiest and most influential businessmen. Chief Okoro had built an empire, and his daughter, Amara, was the jewel of that empire. She had everything: expensive clothes, luxury cars, a mansion in the heart of Lagos, and a life full of privilege. However, despite all her beauty and material wealth, Amara carried a dark anger deep inside her, an anger that had been growing for years. It was an anger directed at the one person she could never seem to accept, her stepmother, Mrs. Okoro. When Chief Okoro remarried, he had hoped that his new wife would bring peace and happiness to his home, but Amara didn't share that vision. From the moment Mrs. Okoro entered the picture, Amara's world began to feel smaller. The warm home she once knew had turned into a battleground, and the woman her father chose to marry became her greatest enemy. Amara resented her stepmother for no reason other than the fact that she was there. She wasn't her mother, and in Amara's eyes, that was enough to justify her hatred. The tension between Amara and Mrs. Okoro had been building for months. Amara would constantly find ways to make Mrs. Okoro's life difficult, from ignoring her requests to mocking her in front of guests. Mrs. Okoro tried her best to be understanding. She always reminded herself that Amara was still young, still grieving the loss of her mother, but her patience was running thin. It seemed that no matter how hard she tried to be kind, Amara would always find a way to push her away. She had no idea that one moment would change everything. It was a bright Sunday afternoon, and the Okoro family was preparing for a big family gathering at their mansion. The house was filled with the sweet scent of freshly prepared food, the sound of laughter from servants working to make everything perfect, and the sparkle of expensive decorations. But despite the festivities, something dark hung in the air. Amara had been stewing in her room for hours, fuming with anger. She had watched as her father spent all his time with Mrs. Okoro, showering her with affection. Why does he love her more than me? Amara thought bitterly. As the guests began arriving, Amara put on her most beautiful dress, a red gown that made her look like a princess, and walked down the stairs, trying to catch her father's attention. But when she reached the living room, she saw her father smiling warmly at Mrs. Okoro, holding her hand in front of the guests. That was the final straw. Enough is enough, Amara muttered to herself, her face turning red with anger. She couldn't take it anymore. She was tired of being ignored, tired of feeling like she didn't matter in her own father's eyes. She was going to make sure everyone knew how she felt. Without warning, Amara marched over to Mrs. Okoro, who was speaking to one of the guests. Her steps were firm, her eyes locked on her target. "You think you're so special, don't you?" Amara spat, her voice cold as ice. "Just because you married my father doesn't mean you can take his attention away from me. You don't belong here." The room fell silent as everyone looked on in shock. Mrs. Okoro's face turned pale. She had never expected such harsh words from her stepdaughter, especially in front of so many people. But Amara wasn't done. Before anyone could react, Amara raised her hand and slapped Mrs. Okoro across the face. The sound of the slap echoed throughout the room, freezing everyone in place. Mrs. Okoro stumbled backward, her hand instinctively reaching for her cheek. For a moment, no one said a word. The guests, the servants, even Chief Okoro, all stood motionless. Amara stood there, her heart racing, a sense of satisfaction bubbling inside her. She had done it. She had made her mark. Everyone in the room now knew how she felt. She didn't care about the consequences. Chief Okoro was the first to recover from the shock. His face turned white with anger as he stepped forward, his voice trembling with rage. "Amara, what have you done?" he shouted, his words laced with disbelief. He had never seen his daughter act in such a way. This was not the daughter he had raised, the girl who once smiled and played with joy. "Get out of here, Amara. Go to your room. We'll talk later," he ordered, his tone cold and final. But Amara wasn't done. She glared at her father and defiantly turned her back to him. She wasn't going to apologize, not for something that she believed was long overdue. Amara stormed up the stairs to her room, slamming the door behind her. She could hear the muffled voices of her father and Mrs. Okoro downstairs, but she didn't care. The rush of anger that had built up inside her for years had finally exploded. It felt like a victory, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. No one, especially her stepmother, would ever forget what she had done. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Amara, one where she no longer had to hide her feelings, that the world would see who she truly was. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mrs. Okoro stood silently, tears threatening to fall from her eyes. She had never imagined that her relationship with her stepdaughter would come to this. All she had ever wanted was to be a good mother, to offer Amara the love and care that she deserved. But nothing she did seemed to work. The slap was more than just physical pain. It was a symbol of everything Amara had been hiding inside. Mrs. Okoro had tried so hard to make her feel loved, but Amara refused to accept it. The reality of the situation began to settle in. Chief Okoro turned to his wife, his voice full of regret. "I'm so sorry, my dear. I don't know how to fix this. I've tried everything for Amara, but nothing works." Mrs. Okoro shook her head gently. "This isn't your fault. She's just lost, and she doesn't know how to express her pain. She needs our help now more than ever." But Chief Okoro wasn't so sure. He had always tried to buy his daughter's happiness with wealth and gifts, but that had never been enough. It seemed like nothing could reach Amara's heart. Back in her room, Amara sat on her bed, her mind racing. For the first time in a long time, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had done something that couldn't be undone, something that would make everyone see her pain. But as the minutes passed, a new feeling began to creep in, a feeling of emptiness. What did it really mean to slap her stepmother, to lash out in such a public way? Did it bring her the peace she had been searching for, or had it only made things worse? The next morning the mansion was eerily quiet. Amara sat by her window, staring out at the Lagos skyline. The city, bustling and alive, felt like a world far away from the anger and tension that filled her home. She had expected to feel triumphant after her slap, but now, as the silence stretched on, it only felt like a heavy burden. Was this really what she wanted? To push everyone away? Her father had always been too busy to notice her struggles, but after last night, she wasn't sure if that mattered anymore. What did it matter if he finally acknowledged her pain, if she had to hurt the people around her to get it? Downstairs, Chief Okoro paced back and forth, trying to figure out how to fix the mess his daughter had created. He hadn't slept a wink. How could he have let things get this bad? He had spent so many years focused on building his empire that he had neglected his family. The news of Amara's slap had caused a ripple effect, not just in their home but across the entire city. Gossip was swirling, and Chief Okoro was no stranger to the public eye. He had worked hard to protect his family's image, but now his own daughter was threatening to tear that image apart. Mrs. Okoro, on the other hand, was lost in her own thoughts. She had spent the night in her room trying to make sense of what had happened. The slap had been more than just a physical attack. It had been a rejection of everything she had worked so hard for. She had married Chief Okoro not just for his wealth, but for the family he had. She had hoped to build a life with Amara, to help her heal from the wounds left by her mother's passing. But now she was beginning to wonder if that dream was even possible. Amara's bitterness seemed so deep, so ingrained in her soul, that Mrs. Okoro didn't know where to start. "I'll talk to her," Chief Okoro said, trying to reassure his wife. But Mrs. Okoro only shook her head. "She won't listen to you. She doesn't listen to anyone." Her voice was soft but filled with an undeniable sadness. She had tried so hard to be a good stepmother, to love Amara as her own daughter, but no matter what she did, it never seemed to be enough. "Maybe it's time we try something different," she suggested quietly, her eyes downcast. Meanwhile, Amara was still sitting in her room, her thoughts a whirlwind. At that moment there was a knock on her door. Amara ignored it, but the knock came again, this time more insistent. With a sigh, she got up and opened it. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Okoro standing there, her face calm but with an expression that Amara couldn't quite read. The stepmother, who Amara had thought would never dare to confront her again, was standing there, offering an olive branch. "We need to talk," Mrs. Okoro said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going to yell at you, Amara. I'm not here to fight. I just want to understand what happened." Amara stood still for a moment, the anger in her chest rising once again. "What's there to understand?" she spat, stepping back. "You've always been in the way. My father was mine first. Why did you have to come in and ruin everything?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but she quickly wiped away the tears that threatened to spill. Mrs. Okoro didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she stepped into the room and sat on Amara's bed, as if waiting for the storm to pass. "I understand that you're angry, Amara," Mrs. Okoro began softly. "I understand that you're hurting, but slapping me, hurting me like that, it's not going to help you heal. It's only going to make things worse." She looked directly at Amara, her eyes filled with empathy. "I never wanted to replace your mother. I could never replace her. But I wanted to be here for you, to help you through your pain. I know it's hard, but pushing me away isn't the answer." Amara stared at her in disbelief. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had expected anger, perhaps tears, but not this quiet strength. Her stepmother wasn't backing down. She was still standing in front of her, still offering her care, despite the slap, despite the years of tension between them. The words seemed to penetrate Amara's heart in a way she didn't expect. "I don't need your help," Amara muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. Deep down she knew she was lying. She had been trying to convince herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was better off alone, but that lie was becoming harder and harder to believe. Amara had spent so many years hiding her pain, pretending to be fine, but now it was all coming to the surface. Her anger, her loneliness, her heartbreak, it was all pouring out, and she didn't know how to stop it. Mrs. Okoro reached out and gently touched Amara's hand. "You're not alone, Amara," she said softly. "You never were." It was the first time anyone had said that to her in years, and the words felt foreign but comforting. Amara didn't know how to respond. Her heart was a tangled mess of emotions, rage, sadness, guilt, and something she couldn't name. But one thing was clear. She was no longer in control. The wall she had built around herself was starting to crack, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do.